Good. Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview.
Oh,
Great to talk with you.
my pleasure.
We could start with just how you've come to this vantage that you have and this action that you're taking, this work that you're doing. What led you to be here and what it is that, as succinctly as you can, you're trying to do with this project.
The Kids Risk Project is all about improving the lives of kids and really crossing disciplines that now don't actually cross one another in a way that empowers parents, policymakers, teachers, everyone to make better choices that actually improve life for kids. It's really, partly motivated by my own experience as a parent and as an educator, but also really a passion to make a difference in the lives that we all live.
That's the place where I feel the greatest resonance. I don't know if you saw, but where we come from is stewarding the health of children's learning as being the central, and whatever is not determined by the circumstances of their birth or the constraining circumstances of their environment, is that how they learn their way into being who they are in the world. So we're trying to turn up the knob on that and remove the encumbrances, and that's how we get to this.
Mm-hmm.
One of our perhaps our most specific interest is to create a backdrop for understanding the various things kids are at risk for, so that we can talk about this reading challenge in relation to those. So any way that you'd like to go into that space that would kind of summarize, give us a framework to start with about what children are at risk for today, which is different. On your website, you talk about, well, we don't have to worry about this polio, we don't have to worry about this. These things we don't have to worry about. But there's still a lot of things we do have to worry about.
Absolutely.
So let's give some framework to that and then drill down into some of those.
Okay, so let me give you the context about the Kids Risk Project. We take on everything. We look at all the risks, and that spans the injuries and the risks that people generally are familiar with in the context of illnesses. But it also looks at the cognitive risks that kids face. And, one of the things that we're really interested in is looking at where people perceive risks to kids and how those perceptions actually do or don't match with reality. Now, one of the big areas that we... That's not mine. That's okay. At least it's nice music, Well, I'll start over with the answer so we can go from there. Oh, you can't turn it off?
Well, I could, but then I would actually, somebody would know I was turning it off as opposed to letting it.
Oh, there you go. Okay, it's out of juice is a different story. Okay, so the Kids Risk Project looks at all of the different types to risk. The Kids Risk Project looks at all the different types of risks to kids. And we look at injuries, which are, of course, the leading cause of morbidity and mortality. We look at illnesses and medical interventions and the things that we can do to improve children's health with vaccines and things like that. But we also look at the educational and the cognitive side of children's lives. And we've really gone into the experiences of today's kids, looking at how they experience media, how they learn, what they learn, and really trying to understand what it means to be a whole kid in the world today.
Fantastic. And that's precisely where we want our conversation to take it. Most people think children are at risk for various kinds of physical or mental developmental disorders. That's probably tops the list of things. Various kinds of abuses and what have you. And a lot of attention and money gets channeled into those areas, while we are less clear in our thinking about these other things, which seem more murky or not as obvious to us. We start with those things that are more obvious,
right?
And talk about. I don't know whether you use. Our preference in order to tie this into other things is to talk about the percentages of the population that are at risk for different things. We cut it at 5-year-old or 8-year-old or under 18. I don't know what your rubrics are for chopping that up or dicing the data, but I'd like to if we were taking a serious approach to Letterman's top 10 and we were saying, okay, what are the top things children are at risk for?
Yep.
What would be number one?
Well, the major risk that we think about in public health is usually injuries, because one of the things that we see in hospital emergency rooms, kids show up with broken bones, contusions, all kinds of things. In some cases, those are injuries that could be prevented. And that's where, as public health professionals, we spend most of our time trying to educate people and empower them to take advantage of the opportunities that they have. So, for example, when it comes to kids, we work hard to try and get all kids buckled up or in child safety seats because those save lives. And we know that if, in fact, we educate parents and they actually take action and prevent those risks, then in fact we have healthier kids growing up to be stronger, healthier adults. So that's usually the number one thing that we think about. And when we're talking about numbers, about 5,000 kids every year are impacted by serious motor vehicle accidents. And so saving those kids with car seats and seatbelts is a really big deal. I mean, it makes a huge difference in the public health. So that would be one thing that you should definitely have at the top of your list. And again, my emphasis is really on not only knowing what the big risks are, but what we can do about them, because that's really where the opportunity is to make a big difference.
Try to get traction if we don't think there's anything we can do.
Well, right. I mean, I think the challenge is to make sure that people realize that they have the opportunity to make a difference. One thing I frequently try to, encourage people to remember is that public health means that we have to put the public and health together. We need to keep the public in public health. And so it's really important for people to understand what the risks are. Another injury that we think about, or I've thought a lot about, is drowning. I mean, that's something where you might be surprised, but we lose more than 1 in a million infants in this country from drowning in bathtubs. And those are all preventable. These are unintentional deaths where people have just left the child unattended in the bathtub and they drown. That's really remarkable in this day and age when you think that, we know better, but somehow we don't sometimes. So we focus a lot on trying to understand what are the perceptions that people have about the risks. And people have a perception that if they're in the bathtub with an older sibling, they're going to be fine. The older sibling might save them, or that they'll be okay if they can sit up, they can sit up. That's just not right. And so one of the things that the Kids Risk Project is really trying to do is help people understand what age is appropriate for different types of behavior and what parents should expect and what they need to know to keep their kids healthy and strong and safe. So those are major themes. I think another area that we've really focused a lot on that is fairly novel is really trying to understand the entertainment media and the popular media and what messages people get from those about risks in general. And I think that's an area where for many people, media just come right under the radar screen. They're not paying attention to the fact that you have basically a very powerful and persuasive teacher in your living room with your television. And, I think it's different for me. I grew up in a family that had one television, and we would watch TV together. And until I was in high school, we didn't have more than one TV in our house. So by definition, it was a family activity. And this was, I'm not that old, but before the VCRs and VHS. And so when we went to the movies, we all went together and we'd drive in the same car and we'd talk about it. And it was, again, a shared experience. That's really different today. Now we have media being extremely personalized. We certainly see media targeted at different audiences. And in fact, you will find it not uncommon to have young children, even very young children, with a television in their room. So one of the things that we've focused a lot on is trying to help parents understand what messages kids are getting from media. In many cases, messages about violence being the solution to problems and about drugs and alcohol being something that is normal and okay and doesn't have any consequences. These are things that parents really need to be aware of in terms of education that their kids are getting from a backdoor source, really.
If we were to say children, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, or children born today are at risk of developing or encountering an experience or an incident that is life-harming.
Mm-hmm.
Right? and we could say there's a grid of dimension of life harm,
Mm-hmm.
right? From near fatal and physically contorting to psychologically warping. We say there's this one grid, which is the dimension of life harm. And the other one is the dimension of the population at risk for
Yes.
that life harm.
Yeah.
And so if we were to say, again, in those terms, and as close to percentages as we can, what is it that children are most at risk for as they come in here? You mentioned, the injury.
Yep.
You said 5,000 children. Well, let's start with how many children are there?
Okay. Well, so let's go actually what I probably should do is give you a chart, which would actually help you. So I didn't bring that down, but I can do that when we're done.
Yeah,
I'll go back up.
To speak to that.
Sure. Okay. So when we think about how many children are there, obviously it depends on how you define a child. In the Kids Risk Project, we define children broadly. So we sometimes even think about kids as old as 21, those college-age students who are not really kids, but they're still dependent on their parents, and in some ways they're a different population than the adult population. Those are young adults really in transition.
So the threshold might be young dependent.
Yes, might be. In the context of the way that we typically think about risks, I tend to characterize children as everybody from 0 to 18 or 0 to 19, but usually 0 to 18. And there we're talking about actually almost 38 to 40 million Americans. So quite a big part of our population actually are children. And of course, they don't vote and they don't have a lot of the privileges that adults have. So they're often valued in the context of political debate and discussion, but they're certainly a major part of our overall population size. Now, when we talk about what are some of the things that actually kill kids, the things that come up at the top of the list are injuries, different types of injuries. So motor vehicles are a big one. We certainly see transportation risks with bike safety being an issue and bicycle accidents being an issue, pedestrian safety being an issue. So all of those motor vehicle related or transportation related risks are a big one. I mentioned drowning as another one that comes up at the top of the list, but also things like fires and suffocation, strangling are also big things at the top of the list when we look at what are things that kill children. I think one of the things that certainly there's been a lot of attention to more recently, guns. When we look at risk to kids, we again see that more than 1 out of every 1 million children die every year from being shot by a gun. Which again, when you start to say, well, is that a lot of kids? It turns out to be a lot more kids than should be being affected by guns and by violence in our society. So I think when you want to start talking about other types of, or other levels, so maybe if we back away from mortality.
But nonetheless
significant.
Life-altering.
Yes.
Life-warping, life-diminishing.
So if we turn to that, if we start to look at morbidity or basically diminishing quality of life, but not necessarily killing children, then we start to see a lot higher numbers in terms of what ends up putting kids into the emergency room or leading to major changes in their lives. And certainly the injuries are still up there. We do see huge numbers of kids showing up in the emergency room, from all different types of injuries, sports injuries, motor vehicle injuries, everything. But we also see at that level illnesses like asthma. We're certainly seeing obesity as a major threat at this point, and then mental health. And I think, in the context of mental health, we really haven't got a good grip on the pediatric population at all. I mean, what's interesting to me is that we really don't have a good sense of metrics of childhood depression, and we really don't have systems in place to actually preempt some of the more severe mental health challenges that today's children are actually facing. So in the context of the work we do, we've really focused on some of the most important messages that we think kids today need, like hope and empowerment and the idea and vision that they actually can make a big difference, and that the choices that they make in their life not only are ones that will improve their own lives, but improve lives of others. So we focus on trying to help to make sure that we understand why we have 15% of our kids that are overweight and what that's going to mean when in fact they grow up and we're starting to see, even very young adults or maybe even adolescents with heart disease that we wouldn't have seen, in that population even 10 years ago. Those are all the kinds of things that we think about.
The National Institute of Health has some risk factors related to attention deficit disorder, various types of mental disorders. Do you track that too in your grid, those kind of issues? To
some degree. I think the current estimate is that it's about 10%, 9 to 10% of kids that have some level of ADHD or mental health type of, diagnosis. But it's hard to track those because they seem to be changing, fairly rapidly. ADHD is a fairly new phenomenon in the sense of its widespread recognition. And so, that's been something where, we've been trying to track it and understand what's happening there. And that's, again, really an emerging area when it comes to children's health. And I think it's an area that not only affects a lot of parents, but also affects all of us going forward in terms of how the kids grow up and function in the context of our society.
I think what I want to do is there something a question that would get at kind of the heart distinction that you're working from that you'd like asked to bring that out, or that you would like to bring out?
Well, tell me more about what in particular you're really interested in, because that's where I'm having a hard time.
That's where I'm about to go.
Okay.
I wanted to pause and
that's fine.
Provide that opportunity first. It's our sense that if you look at the NAEP scores, which we have 88% of Black fourth grade children reading below proficiency.
Yep.
64% of the 12th graders in this country leaving school reading below proficiency. We know that this is significantly life diminishing.
No question.
In terms of their enablement in the world, irrespective of its psychological and cognitive consequences.
Right.
When we put that aside, when we look into, let's look at what the cognitive consequences of this are. Excuse me, I'm still wrestling with this cold. We talked to the cognitive and neurosciences about what reading does for the development of a healthy, cognitive infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question it builds it.
Mm-hmm.
So the ability to be meta-linguistic, self-critically reflective, which is such an important part of being able to function as an adult in this world, is built by this reading process.
Yeah.
If we look at this from an emotional point of view, one of the most stunning findings is that children that struggle, wherever they are in the spectrum, with the process of learning to read, generalize a sense that that the reason they're having this trouble is there's something wrong with them.
Right.
Which leads to a shame aversion to that kind of confusion, which is decapitating their learning.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about a massive dimension of our population.
Yeah.
That is getting harmed in ways that affect their cognitive mental health, their sense of themselves emotionally, their capacity to function in the world, their propensity to fall into various social pathologies.
Mm-hmm.
All of this, and it seems to us, and these are one of the things we're challenging these various experts around we're talking to, this is the greatest risk children face coming into the world. Is if they don't take off in this, and a lot aren't.
Right.
This is, it's not the most severe in terms of or whatever, but in terms of the thing that most kids are having most life harm risk of.
Yeah.
It's reading.
Yeah.
Taking off. And what I want to do is kind of frame that.
Right. So with respect to reading, I think what we haven't talked about yet really very much is the educational side, right? The educational risks and how that translates into your ability to function and thrive as an adult. And, of course, reading is the cornerstone of your ability to educate yourself, right? Because it is the way that we communicate, language, written and spoken, but certainly printed language is one of the most valuable tools that we all have available to us. And if you can't read, you can't use the library in the same way that somebody else can. And you can't use the computer in the same way that someone else can. So one of the biggest challenges for today's children is that they live in a media-saturated environment where they grow up and a lot of the language that they experience is not necessarily from books. And I mean that they're experiencing language from television, they're experiencing language from music that they hear and conversation. And the fact that they have to actually learn how to read is something where if they don't see it in their environment, if it's not reinforced by the people around them, they may or may not place as much value in it. And then for that reason, they may or may not learn what they need to actually be able to really empower themselves in the rest of their life. So one of the things that I think is actually of biggest concern is something I would translate in terms of low expectations and really what that means in terms of what we're seeing now with respect to actual performance on reading scores and things like that. I do think that the leave no child behind mantra has in some ways made it a race to the bottom, in the sense that as opposed to putting all children ahead, which would be the positive way to think about that same concept of focusing our attention on kids, leave no child behind is a way where we can just say, well, as long as there's nobody higher than, some low point, or that we don't have a group of people who are singled out at the bottom, then we're okay. But the easiest way to move things is to move more people down as opposed to moving more people up. So,
Center of the bell.
Yeah, or, basically just say the only thing we care about is the bottom of the bell, when in fact, what we absolutely need to be doing is making sure that we are empowering all learners and, making sure that in fact we're challenging them with high expectations and giving them, the opportunity to read even earlier. I mean, I think one of the things that people don't realize is that reading in some ways is your ticket to all kinds of opportunities, whether it's a job application and, later on in your life you notice that you can't fill out those forms as well because you can't read them, or, the ability to function in terms of just general school performance. I think the challenge is that we haven't done very well for the kids who haven't had the opportunities to learn to read earlier, or haven't had as supportive of an environment. And the message gets to be, whether it's internal or external, eventually it becomes internalized, that, you're not a reader, I'm not a reader, and so that's not part of who I am. It becomes part of somebody's identity. But everyone, I believe, everyone can read. I think most kids could actually read much earlier if, in fact, we empowered them with the idea that, yeah, they could read, they can read earlier, they can get excited about words, and if we actually put a lot more emphasis on language. So I think the key thing is that really your ability to read defines your ability to learn in the context of our experience of humanity today, really. And if you can't read well, or if you don't enjoy reading, then that really is a major handicap and a major risk factor for all kinds of things later.
Thank you. When we break down what's so difficult about learning to read?
Yeah.
Not from, when we break that down, there seems to be really three different domains to that. One has to do, and probably the most fundamental, it isn't a matter of just intention. It's a matter of whether or not the language field that the child is developing in is calling their attention into making the kind of differentiations in sound and the processing of those differentiations in speed that reading later maps on. If that doesn't happen well, then there's an enormous amount of compensational work that has to happen later to get over the fact that that isn't there.
Yep.
The second thing, of course, is the incredibly confusing relationship between letters and sounds that's in this code.
Mm-hmm.
And the third thing is that once children become self-conscious of this, it lowers the threshold with which they become self-conscious of this.
Mm-hmm.
And as they become self-conscious, feel awkward about it, it actually diminishes the brain's capacity to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes a downward spiral.
Right.
It's pretty, as we talk to people, the consensus is our society does not get it. Our society, this is not as simple as the old ways of thinking about reading.
Right.
For those kids that have the right kind of language foundations, just about any approach to reading is going to work.
Right.
Right. So those children that don't, and arguably most don't, if you look at those stats,
Mm-hmm.
Then it requires something that's much more individuated and systematized and helping compensate for the deficits in developmental readiness
Mm-hmm.
associated with this takeoff, while contextualizing the whole field to minimize the propensity to shame.
Right.
I don't mean to bring you into the reading expert
Right.
field, but again, one of the things that we're trying to get to is that a great number of the children in our population are at risk because of our ignorance and negligence about all this,
Mm-hmm.
of having their lives mangled and diminished
Mm-hmm.
because of the difficulties they're encountering taking off in reading.
Yeah.
And in fact, when you look, to me, the way that this looks is that when you look at all the things that children are at risk for that can really warp their lives, whatever we say the cause of it is, whether we say it's, well, the parents should do this, or the teacher should do that, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
coming through this gauntlet, this corridor called learning to read, is the riskiest thing most kids experience. And I don't hear enough people getting that point.
Right.
Right? So that's what I'm looking like. How can we work towards that?
Right. So I think one of the things that's really important is that I look at reading as a way that you empower yourself to actually reduce risks. And, one of the things that translates into everything. I mean, that's how do you actually buckle the car seat right? You have to read the instructions. How do you actually cook food that's healthy and nutritious? You have to be able to read the recipes. You have to understand what the ingredients on the back of the box mean, right? Reading is everything. And, in terms of how we understand our own health and our own well-being. Oops, sorry about that. Sorry. We do have the room reserved. Anyway, but the main thing is that, reading, I think, is the way that you make yourself empowered about how you make choices about the world and how you actually manage risks. It's how we get information.
But it's not an option. It's not like a child can say, well,
No, it's a necessity.
It's a necessity. So it's not just a self-choice that I'm going to better myself with this. This is a gauntlet imposed by society and culture that
it's the only way that you are empowered in the society to actually manage your own risks. And the earlier you learn, the more effective you're going to be, in the sense that you then have the ability to actually go out and get information and use it. And that's what's so critical. If and again,
so the inverse of that is that if most of our children are not doing this well, then most of our children are at great risk because they're not.
Right. Well, and again, from a public health perspective, we are constantly combating the fact that we are dealing with a population that doesn't read well enough. And, we put out great information, but if people don't read it, or they don't have the ability to read it or to understand it, then we're talking to ourselves. And this is where, when we, want to try to really make a big impact on public health, it gets very frustrating because people say, well, then you have to figure out a way to reach the people who can't read. And we say, we need those people to read.
I have a question.
Yep.
A moment ago, you spoke about being able to read how to buckle a safety belt.
Yep.
About a year ago, I guess it was, there was a study that came out that was tying
Yep.
together the correlations between child safety seats.
Yep.
They were written over an 8th grade level, and they were being
Right.
lowered down to a 4th or 5th grade level.
Right.
So that parents could see that. Can you, if you have any knowledge of that study, if you could speak to that at all, I would appreciate it. My second question is, do you know anyone who's done any research to, for instance, the car accidents were a huge risk for kids. Do you know anyone who's done any research to correlate car accidents and reading difficulties?
No. Okay, so let me take both of your questions. I'm going to try and look at him, but I can look at you. Do you have a preference?
Sure.
Well, the thing, most people say they want you to look one way or the other so that if you, but anyway, okay, so first of all, with respect to public health and communicating, there was a great study that looked at the reading level of child safety seat instructions and tried to understand whether or not one of the reasons why parents might not be using safety seats correctly might in fact be the fact that the instructions might be too hard for them to read. I think my own reaction to that study was, first of all, that it's a sad statement if in fact we can't give parents information at an 8th grade reading level. I mean, I really want to believe that we need to have everyone at that level, and that the real challenge is to figure out how to get everybody to be reading at a high competency level so that in fact we can give them the best possible information. At the same time, I recognize there really is this gap, and so the real question becomes one of how do we reach the people who are not at that level. And at the same time, we're trying to figure out how to bring them up to that level. How do we also make sure that they're not missing out on the important safety information and the other important life, lesson information that they all need in order to make sure that they're healthier and having better lives? I think one of the things that we have to realize is that part of it has to do with our vision of what it means to have a high quality life. And if in fact the image that people have of a successful person is not somebody as a strong reader or as somebody who's smart and makes good choices, that's a problem, because in fact what we're doing is sending a message to our young people that they don't need to invest in those things which are in fact so critical to their actual well-being. And so I think we have to make sure that we always have people out there saying, well, of course, he plays good basketball, but he also reads well. I mean, people need to get those messages that it does matter, and it matters not only for your own pleasure in terms of what you like to read, but also for all the things you have to do in your life. Now, with respect,
it was 30 or 40 years ago where they used to say, I knew kids growing up and say, well, I don't have to do that stuff. I'm going to be a baseball star. I'm going to be a rock star. That's gone.
They all read. The baseball stars, they all read because their contracts turn out to be things that they need to read really well. And it's funny, but people don't realize how much reading you actually do in your life, for really essential things. So it's a really important skill. And even if it's just learning how to read the things that you need to be able to read, if that's the entree to then being able to expand your mind, then that's great. I think the key for us is to figure out how to motivate people who are having trouble in a way that they see it as an empowering as opposed to a disempowering activity. And that's really where figuring out how to bring the different communities who are all at play here together is, I think, one of the most important opportunities and challenges.
Yeah, precisely what our agenda is.
Yeah. So with respect to research on so one of the other interesting challenges about, bringing together and synthesizing all of these areas is that what we do find is that really there are a lot of groups that are very interested and concerned about children, interested in children's well-being or concerned about children. But for the most part, they're very specialized or very much focused on one particular area, and they don't work together. And so one of the biggest challenges for people like me is to say, well, let's see if we can actually put together the data on whether or not the parents were well-educated, good readers, and how that correlates with what actually happens in car accidents. Do we find that, in fact, reading is at the heart of them not, obeying traffic safety laws and then ultimately, making bad choices that that then lead to, big problems on the road. So we actually right now have a really hard time doing that research, just because it's very hard to bring together the folks who know enough about education and literacy and behavior and reading with the people who study accidents. So this is one of the challenges that we in the Kids Risk Project take on, but it's an area where you're seeing integration of groups that haven't played together before, and so it's an interesting place to be.
Yeah, you can only imagine, if you've gone to another city and that you don't know how to read in some other country,
Right.
and you're trying to drive
Right.
at a decent speed, and there's people zipping all around you, and you're also trying to read what's going on and stuff, where you're
Right.
supposed to go, and now put that here,
Right.
somebody who can't read well.
Right. And again, I think for those of us who do read, it's really hard to imagine life as a non-reader. But the reality is, so much of the stuff that's important in your environment you don't understand or don't see. And so, we really have to recognize that it's a different experience. And, I think if you've ever traveled to a foreign country where they use a different alphabet and a completely different language, then you have this sense of, wow, here even though I'm a smart person, I don't know how to even get around. And, that's a really enlightening experience for all of us. I mean, I do think one of the things that is really important for kids today is not only learning English, our language, but learning another language too. And, what we're seeing with kids around the world in other developed countries is that they are learning 2 languages. They're sometimes learning 3. And we are here not really emphasizing the opportunity to understand the code in other ways in the same way that we really should be. So I think it actually goes beyond understanding at the very basic level to even taking it to the next level. And that's where I think nationally we face a major risk in terms of our competitiveness, because we actually don't have the same kind of skills in our workforce that other countries have, and we will suffer for that.
You mentioned motivation a bit earlier, and motivation is kind of inversely related to shame.
Right.
And that sometimes it's a case of no matter what we do to pump the motivational side up,
Mm-hmm.
Once this shame aversion forms. I mean, we talked to somebody today that described a number of experiences with young people growing up. One kid was so traumatized about the reading thing, and this is not uncommon. It's
Right.
unbelievably not uncommon. It's stunning. That he noticed that while everybody thought something was wrong with him, there was a kid in the room that was deaf.
Yeah.
And nobody gave him any trouble about the reading thing. So he pretended he was deaf, all the way up to the point as a 6-year-old that he had surgery, exploratory surgery done
Wow.
in his ears, right?
Wow.
That he knew it was all a farce at 6 years old, but it was easier to put up with the surgery, being taken away from his parents and everything
Wow.
else than the shame of this. The stories like this are unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's how powerful this aversion is to feeling stupid.
Yeah.
Because the children are experiencing a kind of confusion that's artificial. It has no precedent in the organismic
Yeah.
evolution of this being we are.
Yeah.
It's artificially confusing. And the context is such that the confusion is experiencing that the child feels like there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And that's unbearable.
Right. Well, and the reality is people do form their identities and pretty early. And if in fact you suddenly, for whatever reason, get tagged as a non-reader or as a stupid, or if people around you treat you in a way that makes you think you have no potential, then that has a big impact on how you think about your own opportunities. So one of the messages that we have in the Kids Risk Project is that, everybody has potential and everybody has opportunity. And what we need is to be empowering people and doing so every time we can. I mean, we need to make sure our popular media are sending messages about the positive things that kids can do and do. And we need to make sure that they understand their opportunities in a way that really does give them a chance. But I think, the point about shame, it's really tough. And how do you reach those folks and tell them you're not stupid? You just haven't had the chance to actually, really get this. And what we need to do is figure out how we can help you get it and make that an opportunity.
They're instructional casualties.
Well, it may be even worse than that. It may be that somebody who was important to them told them, reading's not important, or you're too stupid, you'll never read. These are messages that, once people believe those things, we have to go after the beliefs that, are sometimes so strongly held.
For the most part, it seems from our canvassing of this that those statements, I'm too stupid, I'm stupid, reading isn't important. Those are actually compensational strategies that the children develop so that they don't have to feel the shame.
Right.
Where they may, in some cases, they may be getting it from the outside, but there are the common ways in which children formulate their response to this in order to disconnect and pull back from this feeling. We come full circle back to kind of where we started, and we look at the massive dimension of the population that's stuck here. I mean, the new adult literacy survey is about to come out. Last time it came out, it was at 92 million adults, right? We're below reading proficiency, some generally below the 5th grade level, and 42 were much below that.
Yep.
Right? Our work to put numbers on this is well on the other side of $500 billion a year.
Yep.
Many times the wars and everything else combined, but we don't seem to get the connection here.
Right. Well, and again, one of the challenges is that it's really hard for those of us in the research community to make the links, because in fact, most of the time that we're looking at things, what we see are the behaviors, but we don't understand enough about the risk factors to know that in fact, what was really happening is that this person didn't understand, and they didn't understand because nobody had ever told them, or because they didn't read the instructions, or because all of these things. So when we try to unwrap it and actually go back to attribute the costs, it's really hard to do that. At the same time, I think your estimates are very reasonable. In fact, the reality that people are not using information. I look at reading as, giving you the opportunity to use information. It's a mechanism to obtain information that you can then use. And if, in fact, we are missing opportunities to use information to make better choices, that's costing us a lot. And it costs us a lot in every part of our lives, every aspect of our lives. So trillions may be an underestimate, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to be conservative in building up. I mean, I have the Assistant Secretary of Education say it's about $300 billion over here.
Right.
I talked to the American Medical Association, and it's $72 billion on this thing, and 40% of the hospitalizations are probably unnecessary due to not following directions due to illiteracy. I mean, even if you round those things off and conservatively pack them, it becomes monstrous.
Yeah.
So when you look at the dimension of cost, and that's in that world.
Yes.
But more importantly, look at the dimension of cost. How many people are walking around that have formulated a kind of sense of themselves that is severely throttling their ability to learn and participate in the world.
Right.
That comes down to them being, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old and not taken off into this.
Yeah.
And I don't know what else is a bigger risk today.
Well, I think the challenge is that one of the things that we can't do is say, well, how does that actually play out in their life trajectories? Because we're not measuring it, and we're not actually following it in a way that we can say that.
Well,
so
we got people at the National Center for Learning Disabilities saying there's no question that there's a line between illiteracy and social pathology. We got people in various dimensions of the government quoting that in many states of this country, the basis for determining the number of new prisons to build in their prison
is basically how illiteracy. Yep.
Third grade.
Yep.
And so there are these correlations. We just haven't gone thump with them as a society.
Right. Well, and the issue is that even though there are correlations in these various different dimensions, nobody's putting them all together and basically saying, okay, if we look at each individual kid and what trajectory they're on and basically how they could be doing better, or if they're doing the best they can, how does their level of literacy actually impact that? If we did that, I think we'd find that literacy would be a huge factor. Now, I also personally think numeracy is a huge factor, because the reality is if you don't understand numbers, you also are handicapped because you don't know how to handle money and you don't know how to get the right amount of stuff. So, I would put those together.
Both are cognitive abstraction processes.
Yes.
The reading thing is more foundational. The number system actually grew out of the alphabet over time.
Right.
And then the other thing is that with math, there's an opportunity to volitionally, intentionally think about it.
Right.
Reading has to happen pre-consciously faster than you can think about.
Yes.
So it's an all automatic process. So
right.
They're similar in their effects, but even if you're concerned with math,
you're still concerned with reading. Right. I agree with you. And that's why I'm saying, I think one of the biggest challenges for risk analysts right now is that we have a hard time actually drilling down far enough to actually see the root cause of some of these things. And in fact, when we look at, the incarcerated population, for example, we can say a significant number of those people are illiterate. Maybe reading is a problem. Maybe literacy is a problem. But we don't know enough to be able to track back to say, was the literacy, the fact that they didn't take off at age 6 and age 7 and become empowered by the fact that they could learn and read and really, take another path, is that the thing that made the difference?
I think that's a misread about reading, that the significance of reading isn't just the lack of enablement, but it's the psychological disablement that comes with the sustained reading difficulty.
Right. Okay. Well, again, it's both of those dimensions. Sure.
Right. But without understanding the self harm done by the development of this aversion.
Yeah.
This shaming aversion to that kind of confusion. What does that do to somebody? What happens when they're ashamed of how they learn?
Right.
What's going to happen to their life?
Well, I think it's really clear that if you don't see yourself as a learner, then you have to redefine your life, around the idea that you're not going to be learning, right? You have to figure out what you are going to do. But if in fact you're not going to be learning, if in fact you've defined yourself as somebody who is not functioning at that level, the options open to you are pretty narrow. And in fact, if you also then say, well, in fact, society, has all these rules, but they're not really important. They don't apply. People are, uncaring and everything else. If you don't become engaged in society because you basically pull yourself out at that level, then that has huge consequences. And that, the fact that we do see this huge prison population is clearly an indication that we do have a really large disempowered part of our population, and we've got to figure out how to get those people back.
Suppose that we really did think that this was this fulcrum point.
Yeah.
Right? Where due to a psychological and cognitive harm done to children by extruding them through this learning to read process in a way that really wasn't, the neuroscientists, generally would say that less than 2-3% of the population are born with some difficulty to prevent them from learning to read.
Yeah.
98% of the kids that are having problems, which is 88%, 84%, 60%, these massive numbers, 98% of those are having trouble because we didn't meet them right.
Right.
In an artificially confusing technological endeavor.
Right. I think this is the problem, that we aren't figuring out how to actually empower kids earlier and teach them in a way that's effective. I think, again, from my own personal perspective, I actually think if we filled children's environments with words earlier on, that would be so much better for them. If they don't see parents, if they don't see people reading, and they don't get the sense that that's important early on, then that's a really strong message. We absolutely have to make sure that in fact, people understand what it takes to be a productive, functioning, happy, successful, person. And if in fact what they see around them is not those messages, that cripples them, permanently. So I think the whole issue of shame and, really how do we actually make a difference there comes back to how do we teach people or how do we communicate to people that they aren't stupid, but that they do need to learn how to do this.
Right,
And that
contextualize the challenge in such a way that it can't go so easily into that negative attack.
Absolutely.
By understanding the nature of the challenge as an artificial thing that's difficult, you can't avoid it, you got to do it. But if you're having trouble, it's not your fault.
It's not
You're gonna have trouble.
right, and the idea that a lot of people have trouble. I think the thing is that learning can. I mean, a lot of reading can be done inductively, and if kids in fact are shown words very young, with a lot of exposure to written words that are meaningful to them, not just, random words, but words that are meaningful to them in their environment, they begin to recognize the symbols and to understand the words. And in fact, they can inductively learn a lot of reading. But what we don't do is fill their environments when they're young, a lot of times, with words, with the written pictures, the code. So if we don't actually show them the code early on, it's harder for them to get the idea that there is a code that underlies all of this. And that's where I think, we missed the biggest opportunity, because it's so much easier to learn things inductively than it is later on, right? It's so much easier when you can see them and start to see the patterns and start to then put them together.
The whole language methodology comes down on that kind of the argument, that side of things. And whereas for children that have developed really good oral language facility, there's no question that they're operating. Their language processor is operating with such efficiency that they can plow through a lot of the confusions in the code. But for children that aren't, and most of the children that have this difficulty with taking off and reading, come from environments, socioeconomic environments, in which the richness of the language, as we talked about before, is relatively impoverished.
Right.
And so as a consequence of that, they cannot induct.
Right.
They cannot get to the patterns because they haven't had enough exposure and
Right.
exercise at the distinction process.
Absolutely.
Is implicit. Yeah.
But this is a big challenge. And the thing is, what you also have to realize is that those kids are devoting attention to other things. So it's not that they are, it's not only that they're missing out on those inductive opportunities, they're also having their minds influenced by what is in their environment, which in many cases is, entertainment media and, a lot of sounds and colors and messages that in many cases they don't have the context to understand. And it's in another way, it's not interactive. It's not something that responds to them. So in fact, what they're getting is that messages come one way, they come through the television, they come through, in a way that isn't interpretable or isn't always interpreted.
It's training their imagination rather than enabling it.
Exactly. I mean, what it does is it gives them pictures of what life is about and, images of what people are like and what people do. And, I think one of the interesting things with the short attention spans, some of the educational programs were designed, based on the concept that a lot of kids who were observed did have short attention spans with different objects. And so they intentionally designed some of the programs with short spots with, very, limited amount of attention at any one point on things. But that's very different than interacting with somebody like a parent when you're playing or a teacher when you're learning. I think that for kids that actually experience a lot of educational media with these short attention spans, we may actually be doing some damage in the sense that we're not teaching them about how you need to be attentive and actually training them to pay attention for long periods of time.
One of the interesting things about attention span is also stretched and built by reading.
Yes.
That in order to read, you have to hold the context, and oftentimes in order to even understand what the sound value of this letter is, you got to read 3 words down the road.
That's right.
Just live or live, or read or read or dead or
right.
So there's so many different things that the stretching, the
Yes.
mind's ability to buffer more and more and more, all at once in order to generate this kind of internal stream of experience that we experience.
That's right. And, it only expands in terms of richness, because what happens is first you get the literal meaning of things, but then sometimes there are abstract meanings that are, even ones that, again, I think kids who are active readers, even in elementary school, start to get those things. And they get excited by it. They're actually really, unraveling the code is very empowering. And if you can't do it, it's very disempowering. So, it's all of those things wrapped up together. But there are multiple levels at which people, really need to get it. And I think from a perspective of somebody who talks to parents about what they should do, I mean, I tell parents, start reading to your kids from the day they're born. Whatever you read, for yourself, read to them for the first few weeks, but just read it out loud so they hear people reading, hear you reading, and make sure that that becomes part of the daily routine. That's the most important gift you can give to your kids, is the idea that reading is important enough that you do it every day, and you do it, and they should do it. So you start out reading to them, and eventually you want them to read to you, and you want to read together and make it part of your life. But, it's the tool that we have to communicate with each other. And, we really have to make sure that we do a better job giving kids earlier exposure to not only hearing people read, but opportunities to read things themselves. And,
I feel comfortable doing it, and you can get the cues and feedback from it.
Yeah.
This comes down, though, in order to effectuate what you said, to our population, to the adult population.
Yeah.
Realizing that this is just a whole lot more significant.
Yeah.
Than, well, the kid will read or the kid won't read.
Right.
Right? Many teachers, we talk to young adults in their early 20s who grow up thinking, one of them just brought tears to us. I grew up thinking that basically I was a waste of breath.
Wow.
You wouldn't believe the stories.
Yeah.
The pain. And these are people that are just cruising through the back of the classroom.
Yeah.
And people are just passing them rather than
deal with them.
As long as they're not a behavioral problem.
Right.
Because once they get past the 3rd or 4th grade and they're not reading, nobody knows what to do with them.
Right. Right.
There's 100 million of them.
Right. But they need to read.
They definitely need to read. What that means is that parents, adults, the adults of humanity,
Yeah.
the adults of America have to recognize that the children of America are at great risk because of how the adults are failing to understand and act with respect to this.
Yes.
And that, in fact, and this is the point I'm trying to get to, this is the greatest thing these kids are at risk for. Not in terms of their fatality, but as a population as a whole, in terms of threat to their life, their well-being in life. This is it.
Well, I think you're right. I think if they can't read, this is going to have the major, impact on their lives, on the quality of their lives, and probably also on the length of their lives.
So good. So what I want to do is have you reiterate that as a cleanly.
Yeah.
We'll talk about what we can do about it.
Okay. So, let me try again. All right. Well, I think what parents need to realize is that reading is essential for their own lives and for their kids' lives. And you absolutely must teach your children to read. If they don't have that ability, it's going to truly decrease the quality of their life. It's going to change the trajectory of their life, and it'll probably also shorten the length of their life in a way that you would never be able to understand if well, there we go. Lost it.
That's talking to the parent at the personal level. Let's talk to the adult at a social level.
Okay.
Which includes the president and the Congress and the teachers and the powers that be at Harvard.
Okay.
Adults of America are saying, listen, adults of America, wake up. This is at risk for the children of America.
Okay. All right. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if I'm ready. All right. Well, I think people really need to have a wake-up call here, which is that reading is essential. And in fact, it's one of the inability of people to read, our young people to read, is one of the greatest risks that we all face today. Not only do they face a great risk because it changes their life, their quality of life, their length of life, and everything about their lives, but we all face a great risk because it costs us a huge amount of money. It costs us a huge burden in terms of our national vision. And it also means that we are not as competitive in the global society and not as big contributors to the global society as we could be and as we should be.
Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry to push you, but this is important stuff.
Okay.
As we kind of put the wrap on this, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
I don't know. I mean, we've had good conversations, so I think we're in good shape. I mean, I think the main thing is that, I'm sorry I can't give you sort of numbers that say, well, not reading translates into this many deaths.
No, I wasn't looking for that.
But the reality is, we really don't have data set up in a way where we can actually really measure the impact of it.
What I want to see is a graph. That says, okay, this many percent of our children are at risk for this many percent
right.
risk for this. Because when I look at it that way, I see reading sitting here towering over all of them combined.
Right. Well, and again, I think, it depends on how you're looking at reading. So if you're looking at reading and you're saying, it's 80% or 88% or whatever percentage you happen to be using from the latest, test or score, it's a percent. We're not talking about 1 out of 1,000 or 1 out of 1,000,000. We're talking about percents. Right, 8 out of 10, which, in the context of, we spend billions of dollars every year chasing minor risks in the context of what you're talking about. We spend billions, going after 1 in a million risks of hypothetical, hazards from chemicals that might be in the environment. Okay, that's a really different domain than the fact that we have 1 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. We're not talking about 1 out of 1,000,000. We're talking about out of 10 kids not functioning or not reading or not living up to the potential that they have because of this inability to break the code. So that's where I think if we start to put the risks in perspective, we're going to say, reading is at the very top here. We need to make sure that people realize that, in fact, your ability to be empowered and function for your whole life depends on your ability to actually break the code.
And in terms of a social fulcrum,
of
where you could invest, that if you could make a change in something, you would have the most radiant lift and effect economically and in all other ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the thing is that it comes back to every dimension of.
Okay.
Are you running out?
No, we just got it.
We just got it. The last thing you said, and then
it ran out of tape. Okay, so I mean, I think the really big challenge for me